This was a particularly beautiful afternoon to be outside. I tried to find the church. But this puts the Florence light to shame, okay? So to just put this in perspective a little, I am technologically not challenged. I'm an idiot, okay? I can't do it, so I can't even set the clock. But here we were debating when to start the proceedings. It's Italy. We have to wait 5 minutes, 1 more minute. So here are 2 stories about how I started my academic career. My very first academic lecture in Germany was at the University of Bonn at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was staying with my brother in Cologne. I didn't talk to a professor or anything. Some secretary said basically this, you come and talk, you know. And we know you can talk German, that's good. Right? And, so I showed up at 2 or 3, nobody there. 2:05 or 3:05, nobody there. 2:10, nobody there. I said, well, I'll go back. Okay, so I left. Apparently at 2:15 or 3:15, they all showed up. I don't know what all meant, but they were all there because it was ST, sine temp, or CT, cum tempore, right? Which is a German way of telling the university administrators that if you're an unpaid associate professor in the 19th century, you're not going to teach the full hour. You only teach 45 minutes, okay? And the other story from Japan, the first time I was at a Japanese conference, I arrived with Teutonic punctuality around 9:03 or so. It started at 9. There was a very long table with about 60 scholars there. It was like a funeral. Everybody was just looking down, very quiet. They're waiting for one guy. That was me. Okay, I've never been so embarrassed. So, the golden light is good for half of the show. Okay, you should be the judge of the other half. So civilization, it's a musty concept. My politically correct friends say, can't we get rid of it? It's associated with sexism and racism and empire and all the bad things in life. And I say, yeah, that's true, but my freshmen really like it. I teach a freshman intro course, and each year I ask them what are the 3 most important readings. Huntington, always in the top 3, every time. So, and I therefore go with the freshmen who express common sense. You know, East versus West, I always tell people, would say, we don't like this concept. I say, what are you working on? They give me their research specialty. I say, let's make a bet. We'll take a content analysis of the front page of any newspaper you want over a month or so. And my research specialty, civilization, it categorized as East and West, will appear more frequently than yours. Okay? And so far, nobody has taken the bet. I'm offering it now, okay? But I'm almost certain that the conventional way of mapping, of understanding the world is with very reductionist categories of civilization analysis, and not just since Paris. Anglo America, it's a particular, as I will argue, a particular manifestation of the West. Right now, we are here attacked by ISIS, that is, by French citizens mostly, okay? Make it plain, it's not from the outside, it's from the inside, right? So Anglo-America is one way of thinking about the West. Today one doesn't use it any longer, but it is, after all, 2 successive empires which haven't lost a big war in over 300 years. It's an important context for thinking about action. And the balance of practice is simply there because, you know, I want to nudge Fritz on to finish the bloody last chapter so that we can read what he has to say about practices. So that was very simple. Okay. Here they are. Sam was not a teacher of mine. He wasn't a colleague, but we respected each other. And when I was doing this project, he was already very, very ill. And he never was able to engage it. But I co-dedicated, together with Shmuel Eisenstadt, the 2nd volume to him. And it has something to do with Sam and I would have disagreed strongly on this. But disagreement is the salt of good scholarship. And then his widow wrote back and say, you know what, I started crying when I read that inscription because he loved, as a diabetic, he loved salt. Okay, so I totally disagree with his analysis, and I respect him greatly as a scholar. Because in that strand of his work, he has always written very important work, engaging the public, he was utterly frank and open about what his project was. He didn't try to shape thinking by insinuating, as most pundits do, his view. He said, I want to change the way you look at the world. Okay? Every third page, he reminds you that that's what the book is about. The book is wrong-headed and actually simply reifies old categories, but that's not. He was totally honest and frank about it, and I very much respect. And there's, of course, Xi Jinping. The Chinese love the concept of civilization. So if my colleagues at Cornell and elsewhere in the United States don't like it, you hit that drum in China, it reverberates. Students go crazy with it. They love Sinicization. My God, that's the coolest thing, you know. And I said, yeah, that's what the Americans thought too, you know, but with Americanization. But have you been in Detroit recently? The world kicks back, you know. It's not a one-way street, you know, and they hadn't really thought about this, you know. But essentialism is the way how China looks at the world. In that sense, East and West agree on how to do this. So here's the disagreement. Here's the map reproduced from Huntington, and you can see it's monochrome. Okay, they're separate and monochrome. So Huntington argues that these civilizations are united, and it's a world of plural civilizations. Okay. So the pluralism exists in the world, from which he then argues basically a position of value relativism. We can't really impose human rights on somebody else who doesn't like it in another civilization. And he argues about the irrelevance of global modernity, the larger context which doesn't exist in this map. Right? He said, no, this pop culture thing and mass consumption and all, that really is irrelevant. People don't die for that. They die for meaningful things, right? Like his conception of civilization. So the question then is, are these civilizations combative and clashing? Sam's argument. Or are they plural and pluralist? And I come to a formulation that they're both. Are they defined by core values around which they cohere, what I would call an essentialist proposition, or are they defined by multiple traditions, strands which are in competition within each of them? Different versions of Neo-Confucianism, different versions of liberalism, different versions of Islam, right? And in this argument, Huntington, as a cultural realist, argues it's a world of plural civilization. There are several in the world, but they are not pluralist. They're not internally divided or contentious. So that was the argument which I engaged. I read that article in '93, and I started writing on it 15 years later. When I finished the project, I had a very hard time getting endorsements from some of my many liberal academic friends in the United States for the third volume, Anglo-American and its Discontents. We had to, I mean, this is impolite to say, but scrape the bottom of the barrel. And the reason for this was that the project ended up being not just a disagreement with Huntington, it was also an equally strong disagreement with cosmopolitan liberalism, okay, which argues that it's pluralist, all right, these civilizations disagree with each other, but it's not a plural world. There is only one standard, of course, the liberal one, okay? And liberals have said the same thing for 150 years, preferably in English, right? And the world is not conforming, which annoys the hell out of them. But the project as a whole was taking on not just Huntington, but also the liberals. Or let's just say it, since they share the same way of looking at the world, rationalist ways of thinking about the world. And so that was, for me, the real learning experience. I knew I disagreed with Huntington. I didn't know how strongly I disagreed with liberals, okay? Including my daughter, who is a human rights advocate. So, globalization and internationalization are the preferred ways in which the debates are carried out at the EUI and at Cornell and lots of other research centers. Was that me or was that you?
I was over there.
I was over there, okay. All right.
Anybody not moving anymore here?
So globalization is the preferred conceptualization of sociologists and anthropologists. who say that what's happening in the modern world is reconfiguring core identities like state sovereignty, okay? And anthropologists are very interested in processes like localization, where the global and the local combine in new ways and remake actor identities, okay? Internationalization is sort of the preferred way in which economists and political scientists talk about the world. They talk about the increase in density, but not about a reconstitution of identities. It's, you know, there's more stuff crossing borders, but the borders are there, and therefore the actors, these national economies, you know, aren't questioned. So you run your data tapes on OECD data, the nation state is the actor. So varieties of capitalism would be sort of an example for that, okay? Now what they share is that they have a very sparse conception of that reality, where they conceive of it as global or international. Civilization analysis adds to it meaning. That is the meaning of practices. Globalization, internationalization, which is the mainstream of social science, doesn't think that meaning and being embedded in meaning communities is particularly useful to understanding what's going on in finance or technology or whatever the examples are. Okay. So that is the C at the end of that acronym, GIG. And it is the largest meaning communities which we have, apart from the global context, to which I will return at the end of the lecture. So I want to first briefly talk about civilization analysis, then about Anglo-America, and then about the balances of practice and power before concluding. A huge literature, too big to master in a lifetime. I think my awe of Huntington is that he had the courage to write the book, to be perfectly frank. I had the courage to edit 3 books. I'm still struggling conceptualizing the book I want to write, okay? And you have to admit that you cannot write the book, you can only fail. So he failed in a particular way, I will fail in another way. It's an immense amount of stuff you have to master. Defining criteria for most people doing it, it's urban, language is important, literature is important, religion is important, both in its traditional, conventionally understood meaning, but also in terms of secular religions. Secondly, it's embedded in a larger context. This is something which Huntington doesn't get, but other students of civilization have, particularly Marshall Hodgson, who was the founder of modern Islamic studies in the United States, left at the age of 46, 3 enormous volumes, very sophisticated conceptualization. He was a giant, and in Islamic studies he's recognized as a giant, but many other people don't really know about him. And William McNeill, who was his colleague at the University of Chicago. And Chicago, I think, is the origin of global history, a very powerful intellectual move in the last 20 years in historian study. And McNeill, who wrote The Rise of the West, wrote a very, probably if there's one article which I recommend for reading on civilization analysis, it would be McNeill's review of his own book 40 years later. It's, I think, in the first issue of the Journal of Global History. It is incredibly dispassionate and smart and insightful, okay? And McNeill says, yeah, I wrote a pretty good book. I mean, he was a generation ahead of the rest of the historians, to be frank, right? But I made one mistake. I didn't really listen carefully to Marshall Hodgson. I didn't see that the West was part of something larger, as all the other civilizations, okay? So it operates in a larger context. Civilizations are contexts, but they're contexts which are embedded in something larger. Thirdly, civilization is not an actor. That's why Huntington's book is so deeply flawed. The first 2 or 3 chapters on civilizations, then suddenly they become agentic, they act. And the rest of the book is just about big states and empires, basically. Civilizations don't act. Civilizations are contexts, they're complex, in which action is conceived by actors. And finally, for me, civilization is not a voice which tells us what to do, which is what Huntington's coherence view is. Civilization is a town hall meeting in which we argue about our options. What should we do in Paris now? The majority says we ought to wage war. The minority says we ought to develop a form of Euro-Islam. We had the same debate in the United States after 9/11. okay? It's not that we all were saying the same thing after 9/11. In the moment of fear, the vast majority will react in one way. But it feathers out very quickly because there are multiple traditions that get recombined in novel ways. And that's the town hall meeting aspect of civilizational politics. And then, in order to try to avoid doing binary analysis, you simply add multiplicities. So who are the actors? I always teach my freshmen the actors are states. I know this is wrong. Actors are lots of things. Empires, pooled sovereignty polities like the EU, stateless polities, diasporic politics, a lot of them, okay? Not just in the international, but also in the domestic realm. Multinational corporations, transnational corporations, coalitions, groups, movements, individuals. They do the acting. You've got to figure out, that's what we do in social analysis. What are the intentionalities, what are the preferences, how do they interact, and all of that. These actors do what they do and create what they create, and I call it multiple traditions operating in institutions. Not single traditions, multiple traditions. And we're all part of that. And we're often at the dinner table, will deploy rhetorically the menu which we have available to us in a particular meaning context, which generates multiple processes. So it's not East versus West. Kipling's poem is only known in its first stanza. You go to the last stanza, it's not East versus West. Kipling has a much more sophisticated view of it. So what are the outcomes? For hunting, it's clash. Yeah, it's a possible outcome. I think Toynbee had 24 outcomes in his world history, okay? So why privilege only one? I think the answer is clear. It sells books. So it's, the editors always say, sharpen up the message. But you can obviously conceptualize the outcomes differently, and here for purpose of this presentation, I say they're civilizational encounters. They take two forms and something in between, because the Holy Trinity captures our imagination. Clash, engagement, hybridization. Excuse me. And the hybridization is the shifting balances of practices and power. So Anglo America, I was raised on Louis Hart's book, the liberal tradition in America, one tradition. I taught it for 25 years until I encountered Roger Smith. He said, not one tradition, several traditions, which of course was true before Huntington wrote his book. The established scholarship was not there was one tradition, there were several traditions. And Roger Smith's contribution is to say that racism is one of the most important indigenous traditions in the United States. And what we have since Ferguson, police violence, it's just one more illustration of this. Right now we are I think, in the gestation of a new civil rights movement on campus. It's all part of it. Let's get rid of the Woodrow Wilson School. It's an offensive name, those sort of things. That's all part of multiple traditions. Right? Huntington followed the Hartsian view. Louis Hart was enormously influential at Harvard and, shaped the basic undergraduate curriculum, and Huntington was fully convinced of this and engages the problematic aspects of that view only in his last book, because he didn't have a good answer to the criticism to the civilizational arguments about who the hell are we if it's us against them. And he said, that's a really good question. He wrote another book, and his last one, and he didn't have a compelling answer. He basically had to say, we are not a country of immigrants, we are a country of settlers. So he comes up with this notion of a creed, and we're all part of it, and the Jews and the Catholics don't like it, neither do the blacks. We're not all part of one creed, But he wrote a book about it. That's what I found interesting. He recognized an important criticism, he tried to address it. Right? Anyway, he is in the single tradition mode, as he has to be for his coherent view of culture. And I obviously am in the Roger Smith camp, right, on this. So how many Wests do we have? I'd say choose your preferred one. We use it on the newspaper headlines in the singular, but that is conceit. So you go to Mexico, they're saying that's the West, Latin America. The Americas, very important, the West in the 19th century. You go to Florence, somebody told me today, this is the West. Okay, why not? recently enlarged towards the east, but that doesn't matter, it's still the West, right? The Anglosphere, that was a particular version of Anglo-America in the 19th century, turn of the 19th century, you know. That was a particular version of the West in which race played a much more important role. So the West has existed in many different forms. And the politics of transformation, I'm good, thanks. The politics of transformation are fascinating. What constituted the West, excuse me, what constituted the West in the 19th century was empire, liberalism, and race. You can strike out 2 of the 3 for the 20th century, the mid-20th century. Within 3.5 generations, we emptied what we meant by the West and refilled it with something different. Empire is gone, liberal security community is in, with complex sovereignties, shared diplomatic cultures. Race being replaced by multiculturalism. So when we reduce the complexity of the world and saying there's West versus East, and their core values, I said, yes, that's how it looks at a particular moment. But if you just sit back and think a little bit back, and civilization analysis does have a somewhat slower heartbeat than other forms of civilization. It's not just quarterly returns. You know, you've got to take a generation or two. Enormous changes, not just in Anglo America. This is true of other civilizations, right? So we reinvent the category and we fill it with new content depending on context, on preferences, on victories, on defeats, whatever. So what's distinctive about Anglo America, here's another thing which I always misteach to my freshmen, is what's really distinctive is that the Anglo America in its external community is a security community. It's Lockean. Why? Because race was so important. When the Scottish convicts, or maybe it was English convicts, were sent to Australia, the link they had back to London was so much stronger than the link they had to the indigenous tribes 200 yards away inside the jungle from the beach. And that really didn't change for a long time. So the conception of international order was transnational. And the other lived in the country, inside. That's not how we teach international relations, where the external is the other, defined, let's say, by religion or nationalism, and the internal is the self. That's the principle of anarchy. So Anglo-America sits actually there as a very distinctive conceptualization of what international relations is like. Now, the growth of Anglo-America beyond the English-speaking people, which was how Churchill supported his expensive taste in wine, made a lot of money off that 4 books, right? Went through military conquest, market penetration, and cultural insinuation. And the study of post-World War II Germany and Japan is so interesting because total military defeat led to different ways in which market penetration, cultural insinuation worked itself out. Without stopping, the Germans are still Germans, the Japanese are still Japanese. But the politics of the 1930s is no longer a plausible avenue in either state. And the politics of the 1930s, looking back to 1914, was a perfectly plausible exchange in 1914. Something changed. The defeat in World War I wasn't really a defeat. It was a saying, we would like to continue that story. But Anglo-America really did remake Germany fundamentally, and it remade Japan very, very substantially. Maybe not quite as fundamentally because of the empire. The emperor principle was not broken. With China and Russia, this is a different story. So there's many political leaders in the United States say, well, that will repeat itself. I'm agnostic. I doubt it, actually. Okay, I think Russia, as the center of Eurasia, has a very different sense of self, and China certainly has a very different sense of self. I'm not so sure that Anglo-America is doing quite as well. It might just end up having to acknowledge that there are different cultural contexts in which other peoples and other states operate. So the American and US imperium, by America I mean civil society politics, in US I mean conventional international relation politics, is expressing the logics of globalization and internationalization. So the meaning context interacts with what we theorize and study empirically when we study globalization and internationalization. It has non-territorial and territorial power. And if you ask me what's the most important non-territorial power, I'd say it's being a white brand. A white brand is something in which you can fill the imagination. You can just fill in what you want to believe about America. When I went over there as an 18-year-old, blonde girls, beach, ice cream. That was my view of America, okay? It wasn't totally wrong, but it was very partial, okay? And what America has, America to us is better, right? In some ways already, was expressed in the third letter of 1492 or so when he writes back, America is like a ripe pear with a nipple turned towards heaven. So if you ever wanted to have a sexual and religious metaphor mixed together, that's it. That's Columbus, okay? Reporting back to the king what he saw. Well, in some ways, when Obama gets elected, everybody around the world says, 700,000 people in Britain, why can't we have our own Obama? Isn't that cool, right? Even though the year before everybody told me, he can never get elected, you're a racist country. Right? So America has this enormous advantage of being a white brand. That's part of its non-territorial, subversive power. Very important for the American imperium. But clearly more what we study more is unrestricted access to economy and society. Americans like to trade. And of course, Americans are exceptional. Nobody is as cool as they are, right? And got to make a lot of exemptions for them. They can't just play by the rules. They're special, okay? These two traits tick off other countries. So what about the regional orders in which the US interest is represented? Well, very conventional canon-style analysis. High interest in Western Europe and East Asia, high interest in East Asia now, rise of China, and of course the Middle East, oil and Israel. Relatively low interest in Latin America, South Asia, and Africa. And of course, the only manifestation of the US empire, not the imperium, the empire, in which it can behave like European empires did in the Third World, Central America. And it's a disaster zone, has been for 100 years. So that traditional empire, if America were a traditional empire, the world would look like Central America. That's not a very attractive prospect. So the imperium is something different from the traditional empire. France would run Central America this way, but the American imperium is different. What about the internal pluralism of Anglo-America? Well, the continued relevance of race for sure in the United States and South Africa and Mexico. The transformation in New Zealand of an official biculturalism to an emerging triculturalism. New Zealand is extremely interesting. And then, of course, multiculturalism with its mixture of principled conflicts and pragmatic solution and compromise in Canada and Australia. So the internal pluralism takes different forms in Anglo-America, but it's there in different ways. The balance of practices. So communities, how do you study communities which provide the context in which these multiple actors engage in world politics? Well, one is through norms which are revealed through practices. And it is related to two kinds of powers. We talked about this morning with a smaller seminar. That's called conventional understandings of power. The first three phases, control. And the fourth one, which I would say leads to a world of polycentric innovation. These different civilizations provide different meaning contexts in which different groups, actors come up with new stuff. So here's one example from law. Certainly it's true that the creation of a transnational epistemic legal community by the law and economics literature is of fundamental importance throughout the world, right? Not to be underestimated. But take particular examples. This I learned writing a paper with Ben Brake. international commercial arbitration. There was a European way of doing this, compromise-oriented, justice-dominant, and academics were very important. And the Americans came in the 1970s and said, this is not a good way of doing it. We like to do this differently. Okay. Adversarial process, basically. And in the end, the European says, yep, that's a better way. It's more efficient and it's more effective. So here's an example in which, in a particular domain of law, the Anglo-American empire changes practices around the world to the detriment of European lawyers and law professors, right? But take a second example. When I went to college, American constitutional law was still the model. Now, you ask a constitutional lawyer, he'll say, America? Yeah, it's somewhat like Madagascar off the coast of Africa. It's utterly unimportant. You want to be in the cutting edge of constitutional legal development? Go to South Africa or some other place. South Africa in the 1990s, okay, Canada. Because American politics has made, create an exceptionalism which people say is no longer relevant as a domain of law. The EUI here had a very large and important, under Weiler, very important legal research project. I was sitting next to Karen Alter, who is at a conference right now here on law, right? And it's clear that law circulates around a European node, and that the judicialization of global politics through Europe has been a very important development. In fact, it's Europe, it's not the United States, which creates binding liberalization of global finance. Ravi Abdullah has shown this. It's not Wall Street, it's not Treasury, it's the Europeans who are saying we need to enshrine liberal global financial practice in law. That happened in the mid to late 1980s, okay? The French and the Germans. And the world is suffering from it ever since. National security law after 9/11, okay? Around the United Nations. Okay. So a different node. Legal syncretism in Asia and Africa, still a different node. So legal innovation occurs in many different ways. Doesn't come from the empire, it doesn't come from the top. So which things work and which don't? I mean, it's fascinating. I read into the American efforts to export the rule of law. And Galante wrote an article in 1971 looking at the first two attempts of doing this over the previous 30 years, and it's been an abysmal failure. I think we are still doing it in Anbar province. I mean, it's like we can't let go to export the rule of law. It isn't really about being efficacious in the world. It's something about American self-understanding of what it means to be an American, and when you're abroad, and that's what you got to do. A total failure. Can't export the rule of law. Democracy promotion and the World Bank. People have done many studies, and I just quote it as a mixture between failure and success. Okay? Where's the success? The export of private law. Has remade law all over the world through foundations, NGOs. You go to China, any university invites you. At the end of the university, it's always some legal symposium, the 27th legal symposium about this and that aspect of law, promoted by American law schools, gone on for 30 years. Same thing in Eastern Europe, okay? So law schools are enormously important. And then, of course, these mega law firms, I think 19 out of the top 20 are American. They are remaking international private law. So the outcome, looking at the field of law very briefly, polycentric innovation, not control from the top. Here's another example, movies. We all like to go to movies. So I was interested in saying, how do movie makers decide what's going to make money or not? And it's like in sports, they have good stories, and they say seasoned judgment. And then an econometrician came along and wrote a book about this, and saying the models on success and failure in movie making are as bad as they are in finance. That's saying a lot, because they're terrible in finance, as I will show you in a second. Okay. So it's radical uncertainty. And so you rely on these blockbusters in order to cover your losses. And some blockbusters make money, and a lot of them lose a lot of money. But basically, it's like book publishing. All these small movies, the movies we like, they play no role. You've got to land one or two big selling movies, because then you're talking about return on multiples, 20, 30 returns on capital. You sell $2 or $3 billion worth of a product. So there's Titanic. Nobody predicted it. And as I was telling people in the seminar, it was the fact that teenagers in India went and saw it 7 times. That's created it, the market. Okay. So the habits of a global viewing public, very difficult to judge. It's a typically unpredictable thing. And then who predicted that Nollywood, that is the Nigerian movie industry, within 20 years, 25 years, would become the second largest employer in Nigeria and the hub of a vibrant African movie industry? Nobody. Okay. So it's a world in which there are a lot of innovation happening, polycentric, and we haven't really a clear idea how and why that's happening. It is happening in a multi-civilizational world, not dominated by Hollywood, although Hollywood controls 80% of the screens for big movies. I mean, if you want to go to an industry which is really, it's like IBM in the 1960s. Okay, it's not in control. And here's finance. Knight and Keynes, they introduced in 1921. Keynes writes his dissertations in 21, but he publishes the core article in 1937. Make this distinction between risk and uncertainty. And probabilities are good for a lot of what we do in the social science and internationalization, but not good for everything. And since the late 1940s, economics in particular has been on a crusade to eliminate uncertainty so that it becomes a risk-based world. And because when it's risk-based, it's controllable. And only when there are big financial crises, they say, well, we got it wrong. Okay. So what I learned in 2008 saying is, well, maybe uncertainty isn't quite as unimportant as the economists make us believe. And I wrote 3 papers with a former student of mine, Steve Nelson. And it was very difficult to get any of that stuff published because the economists said, no. You can't roll back the enterprise this long, 4 or 5 decades. That's not possible. And I said, it's not possible, but you didn't get it right. And they said, yeah, that's true, but that's unimportant. Okay. So I think epistemic uncertainty describes a world in which our knowledge is incomplete. It's not saying that we live in a world where knowledge is always incomplete. It's saying there are situations, and you have to figure out what the balance is between risk and uncertainty. You can't just say it's only risk, just as you can't just say it's always uncertainty. Both of those propositions are untenable. So Soros versus Solo. This is a wonderful shouting match. Soros makes all the money. Solo, and he writes the same books 5 times, after each financial crisis, and having read Karl Popper and so, and Solo reviews it and says, the guy makes a lot of money, he hasn't a clue. Well, Soros lives in the world of uncertainty. He makes his money when there is financial uncertainty of the highest order. And for him, it's physiological. He gets an ulcer. He knows exactly. And his model is self-reflective. How does he make his money? He doesn't look at the data. He looks at what other people do. And when they're heading for the exit, he's heading for the exit. Later on, when he becomes so important, they're watching him, saying he's heading for the exit, they head for the exit. So he is manipulating herd behavior, right? Solo works in the world of risk. He doesn't have a social understanding of what people do in a crisis situation. He maps underlying economic realities. It's a wonderful exchange, as good as the Marklob-Lester exchange from the 1930s about marginal costs. So in finance, there are a lot of financial curves which don't look Gaussian. That is, they don't look like a probability distribution. Instead, they look like markets in which things blow up. Here is a Swiss franc exchange rate. It doesn't look Gaussian to me at all, okay? And the poor guys in Zurich have to figure out when to lock in a new exchange rate. It's very difficult, okay? So what do we do in that world? And Keynes says, we fall back on conventions. We invent certain things because we can get up in the morning as bankers and shave and put on a tie and invest $100 million, even though we are clueless about what we're investing in. So the risk-based models, here's another one. They don't look Gaussian to me either. One is 400 years, the other one is 200 years long, okay? correlation from the 1980s, the last 20 years, are very high between those two curves. Right? So the risk-based models on which people bet their money, okay, they're not about the world, because the world is uncertain. They're a convention because you become a respected financier if you have risk-based analysis. So much so that when they developed the technology, which was brilliant in the 1990s, they convinced governments you ought to get out of the way because it's self-regulating. And here are the error rates of the models, okay? 34,000%, not bad, okay? That's in the middle of the distribution. At the tail end, only 10,000%, right? So they cannot serve as forms of analysis. They must serve some other practice and serve some other purpose. And I think Keynes is right. It's a convention for stabilizing our behavior and our expectations. So it's not about being stupid. I was just as wrong as everybody else. Okay? I told my daughter, oh yeah, you ought to buy that apartment, you know. Market prices can only go up in real estate. They haven't gone down since 1946, which was true and wrong, okay? We were all part of this bubble. Maybe not in Florence, but everybody else, okay? It's not greed. No, it's not that bankers are more greedy than academics. I don't believe that for a second. I think academics are very greedy. They may be greedy about other things, but they're very greedy. And very needy, too. So models are ways of transforming uncertainty into quantifiable risk. And the study I would like to do is Munich Re, the largest reinsurance company in the world, because I think that's where the best thinking about uncertainty and risk is. They are always probing. There's a balance of risk and uncertainty. When does it become sufficiently risky, then we can invest and make money? They are very close to a core problem in social science. But you ask an academic about Munich Re, they don't know what it is. They say, well, do you like it medium rare or rare? Okay, the largest reinsurance company. Okay, so that's where I think the very important work has been done. So the outcome, this unpredictability, this behavior pattern, which the agility of decentralized actors co-evolves with the limited controls of corporations and states. Let me conclude. There are two kinds of arguments, and the most when we teach our graduate students, it's about clinching an argument and scientific proof. That's not what I'm doing here. Okay? There's another way of doing it, which is you're vouching for an argument and you facilitate pattern recognition. And I think it's a misread of Huntington to say that he was trying to clinch an argument. I think he was smarter than that. He wanted to provide a world map, you know, and influence how we, within that map, we then develop our definition of science. But it's the wrong map. Alan Greenspan wrote a book after the financial crisis called The Map in the Territory, in which he fessed up to the fact that the map by which he had run the Fed for 40 years was the wrong map. The territory was not as smooth and as simple as rational expectation theory made it be. Right? And I very much respect the intellectual effort at the age of 88 and the honesty. The book is mostly conventional, but the core point, just on the title page, is intellectual honesty. And then there are two kinds of futures looking ahead. For realists and liberals, it's always the same story. Recurrent themes, you know? As Thucydides said, never mind that Thucydides wasn't a realist. He was making up a story, right, for very different purposes. Or this other future, which I believe in, you know, novelty and contaminated cosmopolitanism in civilizational theories. So to return to civilization, what is the connection between these different civilizations and the larger context in which they exist? And here's Anglo-American Islam. Anglo-America is linked through particular practices to that, I just call it now, the civilization of enlightenment. Through English, you know, 22% of the world population regards English as a lingua franca. Of course, most of these English speakers are Chinese. Many of them are Indian. Through the rights revolution, through science and technology, and through this white brand argument, which I made before. Okay? That gives Anglo-America, particularly close connection to this encompassing civilization of multiple modernities. Islam is horizontal. It spans the globe from Senegal to Indonesia. 15% of this is in the Middle East. 85% is not in the Middle East, right? And it has a different connection to the civilization of multiple modernities. And right now is deeply conflicted about it, right? So Cynic, Indian, European, Russian, African civilizations, one would develop other arguments about the connections between how they fit into the larger context. But I do believe that Anglo-America has a particularly close connection and draws from that a lot of resilience and self-confidence. So is it a thin civilization of multiple modernity? I think so. And here are three theorists who've talked about it. Braque talks about Rome, not Athens or Jerusalem, as a transmission culture. Rome was great at road building, aqueducts, all these things. It, quote unquote, had nothing to contribute of its own, as Athens and Jerusalem did. That's an interesting argument. And it's not derogatory. It doesn't say that Rome is unimportant. It's just saying being a transmission culture is a particular kind of civilization. Japan's popular culture industry, which is, Korean pop is now hot, but Japan was fundamentally important. Well, Iwabuchi, who wrote, to my mind, the best book about it, says it has to be odorless. There can be nothing Japanese about it, because Japan is reviled in many parts of East Asia. And that's what they managed to do. It was brilliant, okay, how they adopted their manufacturing strategy, 5,000 spin-off products, to culture, right? Amazing, right? Or Ernie Haas, who struggles with this issue throughout his scholarly career, and in the 2 volumes of nationalism, ends up talking about thin proceduralism. Ernie was a liberal, but deeply, deeply understanding of history, right? So are Anglo-American markets, that process of insinuation through economics and society and culture, are they thick or thin? It's a really interesting question. I do not have a very good answer to it, but it is really an interesting question. So global politics, I think, is not about actors, it's about processes, human well-being, and human rights. And all political authority forms which I know of contemporary world politics cannot afford to say we are not for human well-being, we're not for rights. They all have to say that's a good thing. They're all part of that. And now a common language for articulating our disagreements. People say, well, the disagreements must matter. I think the common language matters. That's the real shift. Okay? So the language that doesn't take away from the conflictual nature of world politics, that we have a conceptual way of talking about it, which is understood in Beijing, in Moscow, in Florence, and in Ithaca. I think that's a big change compared to 2 generations ago. And so global politics now makes it much harder for the imperialists who want to impose a single standard of conduct. That is the liberals. And it makes it impossible to accept the relativism of all political practices, as in cultural realism. So the project concludes with a disagreement of the 2 major strands in which I've learned, which I've taught in my lifetime. Thank you.